Hey everyone, I'd like to welcome you to the very first podcast of The Lion, the Way, and the War. My name is Craig Allison, and I'll be your host. So just a little about me and why we're doing the podcast. I am a graduate of David Lipscomb University, which is now Lipscomb University. And after I graduated college, I worked for the state of Tennessee in Child Protective Services. After that, I moved into the environmental health and safety field and was a director, manager for some corporations. And then in 2012, I got the unique offer to become a campus minister at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, where I currently serve as the campus minister. I've got a family, married coming up in July on 25 years. My wife is a nurse practitioner. I've got three kids. Harrison is my oldest, and Kaylee is my middle one. They're both in school, in college. And then Parker Allison, he's my youngest son, and he's actually the producer of the show and the tech guru. So why are we doing this podcast? Well, a few weeks back, we being the students here, several of the students here and myself went on a mission trip during our spring break to the Dominican Republic. And we were just catching little bits and pieces of this virus thing that might be problematic. When we got back to the States, we had no idea that it was going to become what it became. And I don't remember who, but somebody floated the idea that if things did get bad and I had time on my hands, to start a podcast to basically keep everybody abreast of the things that are taking place at the Christian Student Center. It's just a way to stay connected. So I thought about that and put some meat around the edges of it and filled it in and came up with this idea to do a podcast that's going to be centered around some Christian-based themes. So that's a little bit about me and a little bit about the why and the hows of this podcast. I am so excited to start this. I'm going to warn our listeners today that I am not, I didn't even know what a podcast was. I thought it was something that got casted from a pod of a tree or something like that. My technology skills peaked basically in the early 1980s with Atari. I could also take a cap of a Bic pen. Do you guys remember the cassette tapes that had the ribbon that flowed out of it? And I could take a cap of a Bic pen and I could roll those cassette tapes back up so you could use them. That is pretty much the extent of my technology. So I'm saying that to just ask everybody to bear with us as we work out some of the kinks of the technology as the first podcast. Okay, so briefly, some high altitude stuff. This podcast is going to have primarily lots of interviews. I don't want to be a single person talking the whole time. So I've structured it to have interviews, and the podcast itself is going to revolve around Christ, specifically how to grow closer to Him in times of challenge, issues facing the church, or as Paul refers to it, the way, and finally the war that Satan is waging upon us and how we respond to it. Hence the title of the podcast, The Lion, the Way, and the War. Obvious shout out to C.S. Lewis and his Narnia book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which paralleled Christ and the sacrifice that He made. Okay, let's not delay any longer. I am, like I said, very excited to have two very special guests with us on this inaugural podcast, Ashley and Kaleb Mcdowd. And that's a new name for one of you. So kind of as a way of introduction, Kaleb, if you would introduce yourself to the listeners, and then Ashley, introduce yourself. Just tell a little bit about yourself and where you're from. Kaleb, why don't you go first?
Okay, first I want to say, excuse me, I'm a little under the weather. Just allergies. You have to clarify that.
We are over 6 feet apart.
We are over 6 feet apart.
We're practicing social distancing.
Yes, we're being good. I want to say just bless Parker for all he's doing. Seeing as how your technology skills peaked with Atari. Also, I think it was Clarky's idea.
Yeah,
to
I
do the
think.
podcast.
Yeah, I think you might be right there.
Yeah. So, I'm Kaleb Mcdowd. I was a student director here from 2013 to 2016.
Yeah,
I
that
think that's
time is a
right.
blur for me. And by here,
Yeah.
you mean the Christian Student Center.
Yes, the Christian Student Center, where we are appropriately 6 feet apart.
Yes.
There's just 4 of us, so we're being good. But yes, so my name's Kaleb Mcdowd. I was a student director here from 2013 to 2016. My goal was to study Asian history in college and go into the mission field in Japan. I've always been super fascinated by Japan and just their culture and their history. And so in 2016, I decided to go and work as a missionary there. I got in contact with some missionaries, and I was able to go over there and do a research trip in 2017. And then in 2017, I moved over there, and that's where I've been living for the past 3 years. So that's kind of what I do. I work as a missionary in Japan.
And Ashley, why don't you share a little bit about yourself?
So I went to Harding University and I studied music education. And when I was at Harding, I was really opened. I learned that I had an interest in missions. I didn't realize that before. And so my friend and I really searched and wanted to find a way to get into mission work, but I don't know, it didn't work out. So then I became a band director. Shout out to all my clarinet players. And but then I heard about this couple in Japan, and they needed an English teacher. And I was like, well, maybe I would be interested in that. So I applied, not thinking I would get it. Well, I got it. And so I've been in Japan now for about 3 years. And that's where I met Kaleb. And, now we're living happily ever after.
So you guys have an interesting story about how you met and how that all went, and it culminated in you guys dating and planning a wedding. And I remember some months back you all were visiting here in Chattanooga, and the 3 of us went to eat, and you asked me to do your wedding, and at that time obviously we didn't know about COVID-19 or any of that coming down. And so you were working towards this really great wedding in Texas, which is where you're from.
Yeah.
And so we had all these great plans and everything, and you guys went back to Japan, and you had to leave early because you caught wind of this virus that was spreading through, and you were a little bit concerned about not even being able to get a flight back from Japan to America. So you actually came back to the United States a little bit early. And the plan was at that point to get married at some time here in Chattanooga while you were here, because we couldn't get flights over to Texas, or that situation was had deteriorated basically. And so one afternoon, was it last week, you guys showed up at my house?
Yeah, it was last Monday.
Yeah,
Last Monday.
a week ago, last Monday, and that was a very interesting conversation that took place. And so I'll let you guys just share what happened.
I think we just walked in and said, hey, can you give us our certificate for we did our marriage counseling with you, and you get a discount if you do marriage counseling, and so you get a discount on your marriage license if you do marriage counseling. So we walked in and we're like, hey, can we get that thing saying we did marriage counseling? Also, would you marry us today?
It took me a little bit by surprise. I was expecting some more preparation, but you guys got married last Monday. We did it here at the Student Center. This is your first time back into this building since you got married.
That's right.
It is.
Yeah.
So congratulations on being newly married, and we're glad to have you back here with us. So missionaries in Japan. We're going to talk a little bit about that in just a minute. The The thing that I want to talk about, and Kaleb, you and I go way back, like you mentioned, as a student ambassador, student director at the time it was called. Me and Kaleb don't have any problems coming up with things to talk about. We talked literally all the way back, nonstop, from Gulf Shores. I don't know. We were in that van for about 8-9 hours, and we pulled out, and I don't think the conversation stopped at all. And I was amazed that we were pulling back into Chattanooga because it seemed like the time had just gone by so quickly. So we may need to caution each other on going on and on and on about all the things of the world and solving all the world crises that we did on that van ride. Ashley I haven't known as long, obviously, but for those of you that don't know Ashley, she's the type of person that as soon as you meet her, you want to be in her inner circle of friends. She is a incredibly awesome person, and Kaleb, you're lucky to have her in your life. So that said, you guys, your plan is at some point to go back to Japan now as a married couple and continue the work there. But I want to talk just a little bit about, aside from the wedding, and the reason you guys came back to America was specifically to come back to try to fundraise so you could support yourselves in Japan over the next however long. Tell me and the listeners what's going on with that right now, and how has this whole coronavirus thing impacted you?
Well, we came back to fundraise, and that essentially right now can't be done. So we're just kind of stuck, and it's unfortunate. We had planned on this for a long time. We had planned on our wedding. We had planned on this time in the States, and now we can't really do anything. You can't really go anywhere. You're just kind of stuck at home.
Right.
And that's just kind of what we're doing. We're just trying to wait this thing out so we can try and get done at least a little bit of what we wanted to do. But right now we can't really do anything that we want.
So, Ashley, it's kind of an unknown for you too, as far as when you go back to Japan and how that actually happens with.
Yeah, we just like all of you, we're stuck at home too, and you're stuck at home. Many of you can't work. You can't go to school, and we can't visit those churches. Maybe some modifications can be made. Maybe we can do some video calls with people, or maybe set up meetings with them like later in the year or next year. I don't know, but our plans are to go back. Don't know when.
So I want to talk a little bit about, thinking ahead, forward casting on y'all's return to Japan. As a couple, how does living in a foreign culture like Japan impact y'all's faith and your growth as Christians? How do you foresee that impact?
Well, for Japan particularly, every country is different. Every situation is going to be different. And I think what's particularly hard about Japan is a lot of people don't know this. About 1% of Japanese people call themselves Christians. And when you talk about that, you're talking about any person who believes in Jesus. That's who they classify as a Christian. So you're talking about 1% of the population there. Most of them believe some combination of Japanese beliefs. They call it Shinto. It's their native belief system mixed in with Buddhism, and it's mostly built around Japanese tradition. So the situation there is just incredibly different. And it's incredibly trying because the churches are so small. And most people you meet haven't been Christians very long. And there's not, I don't even know. Before I went, I couldn't imagine what it was like. Because here, especially in Tennessee, you're surrounded by people who believe. You're surrounded by communities of faith. You're surrounded constantly with others who believe the same way you do, who think the same way you do. And I think that's the hardest thing for me. It's getting up and talking to people who are way older than you, and sometimes looking them in the eyes and telling them, yeah, this thing that you've believed all your life, I don't agree with it. I think it's wrong, and this belief system that I have is completely different from what you believe.
And I would imagine talking to them and sharing how you feel and how they feel back to you is complicated because of the language barrier, even more than would be here. And obviously, I know that you've worked very hard and are continuing to work very hard to learn the Japanese language. But both of you, is that correct?
For sure. And I would even say, yes, language is a huge barrier. But even we talk about the divide between East and West, and Japan is such a unique case because it's like the divide is so huge. Their way of thinking is so different. A lot of people, when you go do mission work, you kind of know what you're getting into. And a lot of people, when they go to these places, there's at least some sort of cultural background, and people understand what Christianity is. You know, you said you went down to the Dominican Republic. Well, if you go to the Dominican Republic, everybody knows, right, who Jesus is, right? You're not going to meet someone on the street who's like, oh, Jesus, I've never heard of him. Who is this? But in Japan, that's a real possibility. In Japan, there are people who know nothing about Christianity. They heard about it one time on TV. For a long time, even people I was studying with were confused as to why I was getting married. Because they were like, oh, you're a preacher. Preachers can't get married, right? Because their knowledge of Christianity is just so small. And so it's very, very hard to even relate to them sometimes, what you want to teach them, and what you're trying to say, even beyond the language barrier. Sometimes you can know what you want to say in their language, and they still won't understand it because they don't have the background.
Yeah. Ashley, you said you went to Harding, which is a Christian university in Searcy, Arkansas, I believe. How has being raised in that type of environment, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in Japan, which is, as Kaleb has said, you know, it's not a very religious country at all. As a, let's go back before you got married, as a single woman in Japan, how was that impacting your faith as a Christian?
It was eye-opening. I know, like, people always say, like, you don't realize what you had till it's gone. Well, I didn't realize how much I was relying on my Christian friends and my family and just all the different, you know, our church family and my Christian professors, just how supportive they were and just the closeness we had. So in Japan, you know, we have Christian sisters, but they're young and there is still, you know, that cultural divide. So it is a challenge. I think this is a little depressing, but I've never felt so alone, especially as a single. And before Kaleb came. Kaleb arrived in Japan about, I don't know, 6 months after I did. I was grateful when he finally made it.
Yeah, so does that change for the two of you, the struggles that you had there when you return to Japan now as a married couple? Do you think that helps any, or do you face now new challenges, not only to your faith, but just also as working together as a husband and wife, as missionaries in a foreign?
I think there will be both. I think it will be hard in some ways and good in some ways. I think it will be easier because we can be a team, but then we are also newlyweds, so we'll be facing those, you know, obstacles of in a foreign country, which will be, you know, exponentially harder, I think.
Kaleb, do you feel this? Is that what you expect to encounter also? Of course, nod your head because you're newly married. Look,
Right.
Look. Advice. 3 phrases you need to remember: I love you, I'm sorry, and you're right.
Okay.
Those, you know, remember those 3 things.
Got it. It's in there.
Smooth sailing.
Yeah. this is kind of weird, but I think one thing that'll be a lot easier for me is, Ashley mentioned, all of the Christians at our church in Japan are women. And so I kind of look forward to being able to spend more time with them and stuff. It's kind of awkward, as a young guy to be like, hey, do you want to hang out? Trying to get to know these like older women. And so I think it'll be maybe a little bit easier to make a connection, to be like, oh, well, let's, you and your husband and Ashley and I will go out. Let's go have dinner sometime, or, why don't you come over and we'll cook dinner? It's a little bit easier to do something like that as a married couple, I think, than just as a single man, just because of the like strangeness of it. But for sure it's going to be difficult. There's always difficulty, starting out. Maybe this quarantine thing, though. Maybe by the time we get back to Japan, this quarantine thing make Japan look easy.
So just curious, what language-wise, where are you all at as far as being able to speak the language and get around and talk to people?
It's still a daily challenge. I would say we're kind of like beginning to be intermediate, but then, there's days when you are studying with someone from, the Gospel of John, and you can't properly express what it's saying, because of our limited language skills. So we're continuing to study, and I think when we get back, we're going to change our strategy a bit, and we're going to hire just private tutors to help us with like Bible vocabulary, and just to get into like being able to discuss things deeper, on a deeper level. We can do like good street Japanese. I can order food. I can go to the supermarket, but talking to you about like the meaning of life, is there one creator? It gets difficult.
Japanese is just an incredibly difficult language. Everything about Japanese is completely backwards. So if we were talking, I would say something like, I, in this room with Craig and Ashley, recording on a computer, doing a podcast. Your main verb always comes at like the end of the sentence. So sometimes you're sitting there listening like, okay, what, okay, so you, yes, and then, okay, oh, you were going, you were eating. You never know what's going on until the end of the sentence. It's very, very strange, very, very backwards. And the culture plays into that a little bit as well. So I went to language school for a little bit, and everybody had told me about this language school and how great it was, and I was super excited to get there and stuff. And just the way they teach is so different from the way we learn.
The way they run class.
The way they run class is so different from the way we learn. And in Japan, normally you teach to the test. So there are these national tests in Japan that foreigners can take that can like test your Japanese ability, but it's not really testing your speaking ability. It's not even really testing how well you know the language. It's testing how well you can take this test, and how well do you know the grammar that's specifically on this test. There were a couple things I was learning, and I would ask my friends about it and say, okay, well, how do you use this? They're like, well, we don't use that. We never use that. And it's like, well, we're dedicating a huge amount of time in class to it, so maybe we should? And they're like, no, we never do. So it's a very hard language to learn. I think Spanish takes something like, is it 900 class hours to master? I could be wrong on that. It's like, I think it's around 900 class hours to master. And Japanese takes around 2,000 class hours to master.
Let me switch gears, because I think this is an interesting thing. So you went to Harding, a Christian school. Kaleb, you came here to the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, a state school, but you were part of a campus ministry. How did being part of the Christian Student Center impact your overall perspective on Christianity? For good, for bad, whatever you want to talk about on that.
I think it really taught me, being here really taught me what community is about. I'm still close to so many of my friends here because what we talk about in Acts 2, meeting together daily, breaking bread together, I feel like that's what we did here. We had meals together all the time, We had devos. We had small groups. Just everything we were doing, I feel like, just fostered that community. And it wasn't, we didn't come to the CSC out of obligation. We came to the CSC because we wanted to strengthen those bonds, and we wanted to cultivate real friendships, and we wanted to actually challenge each other. And that's what we did. And it wasn't even just a place to come to study the Bible. It was a place to come and have real friendship, and that meant a lot to me. The summer before I came here, I don't know if I ever told you this. I think I did. The summer before I came here, I prayed all summer long, God, please help me grow in my faith, and please help me to make some friends. And pretty much as soon as that next year started, after that summer, Walter, a former student director as well, was, calling me and texting me, trying to get me to go on every retreat, trying to get me to come to every devotional. And
you said he was like relentless.
He was relentless. And I started showing up, and it made the biggest difference in my life.
Ashley, does Harding have something similar to the Christian Student Center?
There are campus ministries. There's a bunch of clubs, of course. I was in the band and marching band, and so I was really closest with them, and we would have to get to school several weeks earlier than the rest of the students so that we could rehearse and practice and get ready for the marching season. And so we were like the only ones on campus and got to get close to each other then before anyone arrived. And I thought that was the coolest thing. But as far as specific ministries like that, everyone is looking out for each other. Professors invite us into their homes so often, and like I went to one professor's house for small group, and it's just, I think the whole campus tries to do a similar thing.
Yeah. So I want you all to go back to your college days, and we talk about challenges to college students' faith while they're in college. So what if you could go back and give yourself some advice on being a college student and working through their faith issues, struggles, whatever that may be, what advice would you give your college self?
I would tell young Ashley to really answer those hard questions for herself, really figure out why she believes in God. Does she believe in God? Why are you doing all these things? Why do you want to do mission work? And figure that out for herself so that she doesn't have to figure out some of those things in the mission field.
Kaleb?
I would say, excuse me, I would say something very similar, and that is engage with the hard questions. This is strange, but be open-minded. Look, like she said, for the answers to the hard questions. I think it's very easy. I think it's hard for us to admit sometimes, but we're in a little bit of a bubble, especially here in the South. We're around people who agree with us most of the time. If we walk out on the street here and start talking to people about God, we're going to find out some way or another most people believe in the Christian God. And I would tell myself to try and get out of that bubble and try to understand how other people think and how other people feel and really engage with those people. And I tried to do that some, and I thought I did a decent job of it, but I guess just nothing prepares you for being in a place where you're surrounded by people who think so differently from you and who believe so differently from you.
So y'all aren't too terribly removed from your college years. I mean, you're past it by some. What do you all believe is the biggest challenge to a college student's faith today, in today's world, in today's society?
I think the biggest challenge is not having your own faith. I think it's very easy to think you have your own faith. It's very easy to think you have the answers to all these questions and to not even realize that you're just kind of skating by. I think that's very easy to do here. And I think, you know, the biggest thing is we're not searching for those hard answers. And I think sometimes we're even not prepared for those hard questions. So I think, I think that's the biggest struggle, is not being able to answer those hard questions and maybe even being afraid to ask those hard questions.
Do you think that a college student today has the maturity to do that?
Oh, for sure. I think they have to.
Okay. What about you, Ashley?
The biggest challenge or obstacle? Well, for me, and I'm very different from Kaleb, but for me it was like saying yes to everything and trying to be like involved in everything. And that made me feel like my faith was strong, when in reality I was just like showing up to everything. But I didn't, personally, for me, I didn't spend enough time alone with God to slow down. And I know like that's what everyone says right now, but I think it's true. I think in this generation of such like rapid improvement in technology, like we need to slow down and we need to take that time to be alone with God.
Yeah, go ahead, Kaleb.
To what she's saying there, it's very easy, I think, to give the right answers. And it's very easy, I think, to give the right answers to be a part of something. You know, you think, oh, these are my people. I want to be a part of these people, so I better give the right answers. Or you think, well, my right answers are changing, so I'm just going to leave this group because they must be totally wrong. I think a huge problem we're all facing right now is not being able to discuss things without this divisiveness and this like almost tribalism. And I think that is pushing a lot of kids away from church. And I think that is a stressor on so many people's faiths right now, is this like all or nothing attitude. Like you either have the right answers or you don't. And it's like almost if you dare to question the right answers, if you dare to ask these hard questions, well, then you must have the wrong answers. You must be against us. You must not be part of our group of people.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. And I don't know, from my generation's standpoint, when we're challenged on these difficult questions that maybe rock the status quo of, how we've done things, the traditional mindset, it's a scary thing, and I know I've seen it myself. There is pushback on that. So what's the solution? How do we deal with that to where we can have a cohesive, maybe intergenerational connection where we can see this bigger picture and maybe, come to some type of an agreement? What's the and you may not have the answer. I'm just, I'm kind of throwing that out there.
And I think we're all still trying to figure this out, and we're all still asking these big questions. But I will say, I think one of the things is love. And I think that is part of the reason I enjoyed being here so much, is I could come and ask some of my friends these hard questions, and we could really search for the answers together. I think a huge part of that is having an open and honest place where you can ask questions and get real answers, and ask questions and not be afraid of being judged for the questions that you asked.
So it's a safe space,
if you want to call it that, but not a safe space, an encouraging place, a place of love. And that's what the church is is supposed to be.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I appreciate that comment, because at the Christian Student Center, that's something that we work hard to foster and to develop, that type of environment where those questions can be asked, and the person asking them isn't going to feel ostracized or rejected simply because they're asking questions that they genuinely want to know the answer to. So yeah, thank you for.
And that's a thing. Since you mentioned safe spaces, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here. I'm not talking about safe from hurt feelings. I'm talking about a place where you can come and search for true answers with intellectual rigor. You know, sometimes I feel like people, I kind of used to think this, like sometimes I feel like we think God's ashamed of our questions. Like if we dare to ask these questions, oh, it's like God must be ashamed of us. Well, no, God wants us to ask hard questions. In James, it says, search for knowledge. Ask the Lord for knowledge, and he'll give it to you. It says that in James 1. So God's not ashamed of our hard questions. So when I say a place of love and a place where you can ask these kinds of questions, that's what I mean. A place of intellectual rigor, a place of intellectual honesty, where you can search without either party's feelings being concerned, without worrying about feelings at all.
Yeah. That's a good segue into, as we close this interview out, part of this podcast is to actually ask those hard questions, to do some searching, to talk to people who maybe don't see things in the perspective that everybody else may see them. And I think by being challenged, and certainly as my experience as a campus minister, when I've said things that people disagree with, those who have the intellectual maturity, rather than lash out just because they're being challenged on something that they've always thought, they go back and they dig in their Bibles and they're like, okay, is what Craig said true? Is that right? Do I need to go back and challenge him on this? And that's really where we begin to grow as Christians, when we're challenged by those things, and it forces us into the Bible to look and see, what does God's Word say? So part of this podcast is going to be dealing with some of these hot topic issues that seem to be dividing so many churches today. And that's really unfortunate that that's taking place. So I hope that will be informative and helpful to the listeners. Kaleb, Ashley, thank you so much for spending your time, being my first guest.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I hope that I can have you guys back on the show when you're here in the States again, and know that we will be praying for you guys, not only as a newly married couple, but also as missionaries in a country where Jesus may not be as accepted as easily as in other places. I know that the challenge is great. Language barrier is there, so our thoughts and prayers are going to be with you. That wraps up our inaugural podcast on the Lion, the Way, and the War. Next week's episode, y'all are seriously going to want to tune into this. I've got another, I've got a local author, Chris Turner, and his young daughter coming in to talk about a father's worst nightmare, a family's worst nightmare, really. What do you do when you're told that your child has cancer? So you're not going to want to miss that. Chris is a friend of mine, and I greatly respect him. So I hope you guys will tune in to listen to what may be a difficult podcast, but in the end, I think you will be strengthened and encouraged by what Chris has to say. All right, that wraps up the first episode. Thanks for listening. Again, if you want to share this link, if you've liked what you've heard, feel free to do that. We're open for comments and suggestions to make this as good of a podcast as we can. Final words, John 14:6. Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Until next week, this is Craig Allison. Have a blessed week.